We've been talking a lot about tariffs on this page, and I figured why not bring in my actual research specialty, which is the pharmaceutical industry, because there's concerns being raised among healthcare experts that the tariffs that are being issued on China might drive up the prices of generic prescription drugs. So for those of you that don't know, generic drugs are essentially what happens when a brand name drug, the OG drug, if you will, goes off patent. Basically, a bunch of these competitors come into the market in order to compete for some of the sales that the original brand name drug had. So for example, you might know brand name drugs such as Lipitor, Viagra, Humira. Those are brand name drugs. And basically, companies can make copies of those drugs to then compete with the brand names once they go off patent. And generic drugs are an instrumental tool in reducing our overall healthcare costs. So in 2016, generic drugs constituted 27% of overall drug spending in the US, but they made up 89% of total prescriptions. It was estimated that just by introducing low-cost generic drugs into the US market, it generated more than $1 trillion in savings across a decade. Now, a lot of these generic drugs, around 50%, are fully manufactured overseas. And the active ingredient, or the molecule that makes the drug do what it's going to do, around 80% of those molecules are also manufactured overseas. And a lot of the reason those drugs are manufactured overseas is because it's a lot cheaper to make those drugs overseas rather than in the US. When you think about the generic drug market, what you need to know, it's got a very small profit margin. And so for generic drug manufacturers, it makes a lot of sense to cut costs like any other market you would think of. And so that is why a lot of these drugs are manufactured in China as well as India. Now, as we know, on Sunday, the president instituted an additional 10% tariff on all goods coming from China. And yes, this includes generic. Because of the low profit margins of generic drugs, like I discussed, it's hard for these companies to eat a 10% additional increase in the production of this particular drug. And so the fear is that either number one, they're going to fully pass that cost on to consumers, or B, they are going to cause shortages. You might be asking yourself, well, Sarah, how are the tariffs going to cause shortages? Again, it comes back to this very small profit margin. Any sort of disruption, if you know anything about supply chains, this shouldn't come as a huge surprise. Any sort of disruption is going to lead to shortages because they just cannot eat that cost. Now, shortages in generics have been a huge problem, a lot of which is due to the fact that because of these low profit margins, companies a lot of times just exit the market because they can't make any money on it. In fact, as of November 2018, there were almost 200 generic medications that were in shortage. So these tariffs are stemming to